With the election of Richard Nixon in 1968 and his taking office as President of the United States in January of 1969, we see a change in focus. Now, the election of 1968 in the U.S. was about a lot of things, but it was overwhelmingly about the direction that the Vietnam War would take. It was also about what was going on in the aftermath of the civil rights movement, the development of radicalized civil rights, and a radical critique of the United States being offered by people on the New Left, being offered by students in the anti-war movement, and being offered, in addition to African Americans, being offered by cultural radicals known as hippies, the counterculture. So all of these critiques of U.S. society, beginning of the faltering of prosperity, all of which we'll talk about in later lectures, influenced the election in 1968, but really the election hinged about what to do about Vietnam. Now, I'm not going to go into the electoral politics of the whole thing, but suffice it to say that Richard Nixon won the election, campaigning in part on a secret plan for peace with honor. Now, this was immediately lampooned by many, many people because Nixon never came out with any particular ideas. He didn't say what his plan was, but it would bring both peace and honor, or at least be peaceful with honor. And that was enough, along with other things that Nixon was about, in order to secure him the election. Well, he actually began moving forward on trying to withdraw American forces, reduce the American presence, by a plan he called Vietnamization. Vietnamization began in July of 1969, only 6 or 7 months after he was inaugurated, and it was based on what Richard Nixon had promulgated and is since called in foreign policy the Nixon Doctrine, in which the United States would honor treaties, would provide a nuclear shield to countries that believed they were threatened by potential nuclear powers or by invasion from without, and would provide military assistance if the nation asking for the military assistance would bear the brunt of fighting its own war. So having articulated this, in July of '69, Nixon began Vietnamization. That is, the U.S. had already been training military units of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, that is the South Vietnamese Army, to fight in pitched battles or guerrilla-type battles against the Army of North Vietnam, the NVA. But America began training local security forces, both the police and militia-type forces, to fight against the Viet Cong in cities and in the countryside. And so the Vietnamese were being required to take over security and war fighting after July of 1969. Part of Vietnamization was the continued air assault on North Vietnam. We continued to bomb the Dickens out of Haiphong and Hanoi. But then in 1969, we also, in order to slow the supply route known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and to help destroy that, we not only defoliated throughout Laos and Cambodia, but we began a bombing campaign in Cambodia in 1969. Now, this was completely secret. I'm sure that the people who were doing the bombing and the people who were getting bombed were fully aware of it, but this was not admitted to publicly, and it was certainly not a big news story at the time, in part because it was completely illegal. there was no authorization to bomb Cambodia or even to defoliate Cambodia or Laos. And then in 1970, the U.S. actually committed troops to crossing the South Vietnamese Cambodian border, particularly in the south of Cambodia, and actually invading to try to stop North Vietnamese supply routes through Cambodia. The net effect of all of this was to disrupt Cambodian society so badly that the communist guerrillas known as Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge, Pol Pot was the leader of Khmer Rouge, were able to take over the country, and they were Maoists. So remember, this was about the same time as Mao's Cultural Revolution and the attempt to denude cities of workers in order to give them an experience in producing for the country as agricultural laborers, basically turning everybody into peasants. The Cambodians did this with a vengeance, murdering up to 2 million of their own people. Finally, it was the North Vietnamese, after reunification in 1975, the North Vietnamese invaded Cambodia and were able to get rid of Pol Pot and stabilize Cambodia. One of the war criminals who was responsible for running concentration camps has just, I believe, in 2011 or early 2012, found himself convicted of war crimes. So this is an ongoing saga. In 1971 was more just fighting like it had been in the past, and it was hard fighting, but it was stalemated and stagnated. But by 1972, then we decided that maybe we needed to do what we should have, or what we probably should have done in 1969, and what Johnson had tried to do, and what Nixon had actually wanted to do, which was get the North Vietnamese to begin negotiations. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, who you see here in this image on the right, and North Vietnamese Lee Duc Tho, who you see on the left, began secret peace talks in Paris. To jockey for position during these secret peace talks, then, the North Vietnamese army invaded South Vietnam, a massive invasion called the Easter Offensive that lasted from March 30th until October 22nd. And then then at that point, as the Easter Offensive was being slowed down and ultimately rolled back and finally ended in late October, then the peace talks ground to a halt. And in order to push them forward, Nixon assumed the mantle of a crazy man. And this is one of the most fascinating things about this very complex character, Richard Nixon. He wanted the Vietnamese and the Chinese and the Russians to believe he was crazy. And so he just unilaterally, without any seeming provocation whatsoever, began resuming the bombing of North Vietnam from December 18th through the 29th of 1972. This was called the Christmas bombing campaign. He wanted them to believe he was crazy and would do anything to win this war, and consequently, in an attempt to drive them to the peace table, that is the North Vietnamese, to drive them to seriously discuss peace, he unleashed this hellish bombing on the North, and it worked. It got the North Vietnamese to seriously discuss peace, and by January 27th of 1973, just a month after the ending of the Christmas bombing, Lee Duc Tho and Henry Kissinger signed for their respective countries the Paris Peace Accords. The signatories were the United States, the North Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese, and the National Liberation Front also known as the Viet Cong. So the Viet Cong are finally recognized as a legitimate player by the signatories of the Paris Peace Accord and by being one of the signatories themselves. One of the provisions was that the North Vietnamese army was able to keep troops in South Vietnam, but that the National Liberation Front was recognized as a legitimate player in ongoing negotiations. Henry Kissinger and Lee Duc-Tho won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1973. Kissinger accepted, but Lee Duc-Tho refused to accept the Paris Peace Prize. The Nobel Peace Prize. The Paris Peace Accords allowed the Vietnamese government to stand under Nguyen Van Thieu, but in 1975, in April of 1975, the pressure was just too much, and the Thieu government fell to the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army, and we abandoned our embassy in Saigon. Vietnam subsequently reunified. That's why Vietnamese historians call the era of 73 to 75 the reunification phase. They were active, and we had withdrawn our troops beginning in 1973. Okay, this ends the Vietnam War with Vietnamization beginning in 1969 with Richard Nixon's decision under the Nixon Doctrine to require the Vietnamese to take over fighting for their own country. The end of the war occurred in 1972-73 as secret peace negotiations between Lee Duc-Tho and Henry Kissinger led first to the Northeastern Offensive and then to the U.S. Christmas bombing offensive that finally led to the Paris Peace Accords of January 1973. And again, the South Vietnam fell to North Vietnam, and the country was reunified under the government of North Vietnam in April of 1975. We will talk about the impact of the Vietnamese War, the Vietnam War, on the United States in subsequent lectures. At the very end of this, however, let me show you one more slide. Read the green by the scale to the left. Read the red line by the scale to the right. The green is the number of troops the U.S. committed in Vietnam. The red line is the number of killed in action. Of course, that line is going to mirror and mimic, the killed in action line will mirror and mimic the number of troops committed. But what I really want you to look at is this section right here, which indicates 1969, 1970, the steep drop-off in first number of troops. I'm sorry, this is kind of clumsy looking. And let me erase this. This spot right here, we were having more killed as we pulled troops out faster and faster. And then here, we have a really steep drop-off in number killed. This is what Vietnamization did for the U.S. troops. It changed the percentage of troops killed in action. Finally, 1971-72, you see down here that the rate of the number of troops killed continues to drop, even though we have leveled off at a very low rate of about 15 to 17,000 troops. Those troops had resumed their advisory status that's not shown over here in 62, 63, 64. These are actual ground troops. Okay, so this ends our discussion of the war in Vietnam. Thank you.